being here. We're competing with Al Gore right now, so thanks for being here. You either didn't get into that or just really wanted to be here. But either way, we're happy to have you. My name is Lindsay Alami. I co-lead the San Francisco chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby with Chris Jitsi over by the door. There's Chris. Anyway, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit group that focus on really equitable, scalable, and Chris, tell me last one. Efficient. Thank you. This is always his three that he focuses on. But these are climate policy solutions meeting those criteria. So that's really what we're thinking about right now. There are several volunteers from CCL here today. If you are a volunteer, go ahead and raise your hand so people know. Yeah, thank you for being here. In our chapter, typically CCL is focused on lobbying members of Congress, but within our chapter, we have gotten more involved at the state and local level, and we're not the only chapter doing that. So now there's a group of us that have actually formed a new group called Climate Future California, and Carl's here, part of that, and Tony helped with the development of that as well. And so we're more focused on policy at the state level. And when we met as a chapter to figure out what we were going to talk about at this event, that was really what people wanted to focus on, and specifically around climate change and affordability and policy solutions that address both of those. So that's why we're here today, and we're so excited to have our fabulous panelists and Laura, who will be moderating. Laura Klivans is a climate reporter and host of KQED's video series about tiny, amazing animals called Deep Look, and also an event moderator. She focuses on climate progress, including electrification. Her Emmy award-winning work can also be seen and heard locally, nationally, and internationally. So thank you so much, Laura, and the other panelists for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Welcome, everybody. So I'm going to introduce you to the speakers. We have an amazing lineup. Megan Leary, or let's start over here. We have Lane Smith over here. Let's hear it for Lane. Lane is a postdoctoral scholar at the Climate and Energy Policy Program at Stanford University. His research includes energy policy, electricity rate design, energy affordability, and macro energy systems with a particular focus on the electric grid. Thank you for being here, Lane. And in the middle, we have Megan Leary. Megan is the Community Engagement and Policy Manager at Emerald Cities Collaborative. She is working on increasing equitable access for building electrification projects and collaboration with stakeholders across the 9 counties on community resilience building projects. And then we have Tony Serna, who will not be a stranger to all the CCL folks in the room. Tony is the Deputy Policy Director at Evergreen. Prior to Evergreen, Tony worked with Citizens Climate Lobby as their Vice President of Organizational Strategy. At CCL, Tony organized a building decarbonization campaign from the ground up and oversaw strategy. All right, well, thank you all for being here. Thanks everybody for coming. This is going to be a really interesting hour. We're going to talk about reducing electricity costs to accelerate decarbonization, strengthening the role of cap and trade, and designing strong and lasting climate programs. Finally, we will have questions at the end. So if you have anything that's coming up for you, hold on to that, and we'll ask you to ask these panelists at the end. So to start out, let's talk about electricity and why the bills are just so high in California. California is leading on climate policy, but rising electricity costs and affordability concerns risk undermining public support for decarbonization. So I'd like to turn it to you all. If you can tell us why California electricity rates are some of the highest in the country. Why are they so high here? Who would like to go first? Tony, Lane.
Tony, you start us off. There's a handful of different reasons. It's never just one thing, but I mean, one of the biggest factors is wildfire costs, which is something that's being driven by climate change. We're seeing more and more wildfires causing more damage, and that's a lot of very expensive for the electricity companies to address the way that their wires might be contributing to those wildfires. But there are things that they can do to do that, and unfortunately, some of the incentives that utilities have is they want to make profits. They're for-profit corporations, or at least the investor-owned utilities. And a lot of the incentives that we have set up encourage them to do the gold-plated version of how to upgrade their systems. And so it's really raising costs more than is necessary. And some of that's just based on their rate of return. Some of that's based on the incentives that they have to do that. And so we're seeing a real spike in energy costs, and a lot of that has to do with how their utilities are responding to the wildfire risk. There's a whole host of other things that are factors in. Some of the solar cost shift from solar. I'm a believer in that. Other people might not believe in that. There are other factors, but it's really the wildfires, and I would say utility profits and the incentive mechanisms that we have for that are really contributing to the rising energy costs. But I'm sure others have other thoughts as well.
And then can you, Tony, I mean, a lot of people in this room, I looked at who is here, a lot of you probably are familiar with some of this stuff, but still, could you just define what you mean by cost shift for those who are not familiar?
So we have programs in our state that encourage people to install solar on their rooftops, and we give them a very good system to do that. It's a strong incentive. But in doing so, when you're getting your power from your solar panels, that means you're not contributing as much of to the cost of maintaining our electricity grid. And so that cost still has to be borne by someone, and so it's borne by other customers. Now, on the other hand, solar benefits the whole grid because we don't need to install as much transmission systems, et cetera. But what does it work out in the balance? And the economists think, like, on balance, it's probably costing non-solar users a little bit extra for their power based on the return that we provide for people who have solar on the roof.
All right, Megan, would you like to add to the cost of electricity, what you're seeing from where you sit?
Sure. I think I absolutely agree with everything Tony just said, so I stole my line. But I think the other thing to add on to that is that the IOU model in California is a burden to ratepayers. So that's the private corporate utility model that we have. How many PG&E customers? So that's all of you. So that model, very brief, is shareholder based, and it is starting to drag us down in terms of if you go to other states and you tell them our utility prices and how it's regulated, and that we had 6 price increases approved last year without anybody getting 6 pay increases, I assume. Yep. That is also a huge concern and something that is really hurting our families, households, and communities in California.
Lane, what else is driving the cost up for Californians?
So I think both of you touched on some important things. I'd also touch on that just fixed costs in the grid right now, so the costs of, you'll hear folks call it deliverability, which are the fixed costs associated with distribution and transmission. It's a very challenging time everywhere right now. In California, you're kind of seeing this 3-headed thing we have to deal with, where you're having to increase the capacity. You'll hear people say we need to 4x the existing grid to try to account for the energy transition that we're anticipating. So that's one thing. A second thing is here in California especially, we need to harden that infrastructure against wildfires. Some of the gold plating solutions that they talked about earlier, you'll hear maybe some folks in the utility space be very fond of the idea of undergrounding a lot of those lines, which might be the solution in some spots, but it might not be the best solution across the grid that folks sometimes talk about. And then the third thing is we have a very old and aging grid. You saw what happened with the Paradise Fire, or the Camp Fire a couple years ago that tragically burned down Paradise, where it was a 7-year-old hook that finally gave way and broke. So we not only need to be accounting for things with climate mitigation and the energy transition, but just shoring up this aging grid anyway. So there's a lot that goes into that. You're seeing right now in your costs that the deliverability side of things is anywhere between 3/4 of the cost to some folks estimating 80% of the cost, which really makes the costs that you're paying for electricity seem much higher than you might see in other places in the country, and definitely a lot higher than as an economist might say, the social marginal cost that you should be paying for that next increment of electricity that you're consuming.
Okay, thank you. So we know that that's a huge issue for a lot of Californians. There's even a movement that some folks have reached out to us reporters about, called Stop PG&E, about how rates are so high, and like the founder of that movement actually has moved out of the state because their costs are so high, for example. So Megan, can you tell us about how these costs are affecting low and middle income households and communities, please?
Yeah, so I think since 2019, this is the highest rate increase went to PG&E and San Diego Gas and Electric. I think SoCal Edison was third, right? Okay, and it was the increases that started since 2019. Folks in those territories have seen an increase of between 47 and 67% in their bills, their utility bills, for the same thing. There has been no increase in services. There has been no change in the services. There's been nothing different. So for low and middle income households, the percentage of their income going to electric and utility bills has increased astronomically since 2019. Since 2023, which I believe is when the request for rate increases to cover safety improvements and investments started, it's gone even further. The bulk of that increase is since 2023. So there seems to be no end in sight. I think that for low and middle income families that are looking at this happen, playing out in the news, PG&E and other utilities going to the CPUC, the California Public Utilities Commission, requesting these rate increases, there seems to be no ceiling. And there really isn't. Regulators have not imposed anything as of yet. Nothing is, we are hopeful, we can talk about that. But so the impact on the ground in people's homes is that disposable income is no longer disposable. It has to go to these bills. And people are starting to be faced with very difficult choices, like you mentioned, moving, which is often not an option. And if you are a renter, you are in an even tighter spot. You do not have much mitigation available to you. So that's, yeah.
Have you seen any sort of efforts it sounds like you're working with certain communities. Are there any interesting innovative efforts among communities to address these costs or work around these costs?
So I think the thing that's come in the last actually just few months is the realization that many folks are not enrolled in the correct rate program with their utility. And it's like the secret sauce that nobody seems to know about. And quite frankly, and I do this for a living, until a few months ago didn't know how few people were actually enrolled in the correct rate payer program for their income level, housing type, etc. So that is a huge thing that I think is, I guess a workaround would be a word, but it would minimize some rate increases. Not all of them, but it at least would get you a little bit better. So that's one thing that's going on. But there is not some giant mobilization on the part of utilities to get people enrolled. I'm looking around in the room and I'm seeing very few people nodding that nobody knows what I'm talking about. So, whoops. That's one thing. I think the other is the normal stuff that you see, cutting back on various uses of things. I can only really speak to the Bay Area because this is, most homes in the Bay Area do not have air conditioning, right? So you're seeing less and less people going out and buying air conditioning units in an attempt to keep their utility bills low, which causes all sorts of problems in extreme heat days and times. So things of that nature are happening, but it's, we don't have, in the Bay Area, only 50% of homes have central heat and air. They use an auxiliary and supplemental appliance for that, and we're seeing people cut back on those things.
Tony, what are some realistic ways policymakers could bring down electric bills?
Well, I mean, as Megan was saying, one of the things is getting people enrolled in the right programs, and one of the problems is that we don't actually give utilities the right incentives to make sure they enroll people in the right programs. They make more money when you're in the wrong program. So what are they going to do? Nothing. So if we actually create performance, they call them performance incentive mechanisms, where you actually give the utility a little extra profit when they make sure that everyone's enrolled in the right programs. And so like that's just one example of aligning our incentives for or our goals of equity, of affordability with their profits. So that because right now their profit motive, is to they're going to try and make as much money, and right now they're going to do that in the easiest way, and that's not always aligned with our other societal goals. We really do need to reform the rate structure. There's been some movement towards that in California already to create more income adjusted flat fees are being tried. That's going to be kicking in soon, but that's only beginning to address the issue that Amy's mentioned of that the distribution costs are really the main cost. It's not the electricity itself, it's the fact that you are connected to an electricity grid that is the service that you're really getting, so that you get, even if you're only getting one electron every once in a while, you're still paying for that service of being connected to the grid, and we should have our rates reflect that in some way. That said, we also need to find other sources of money to go into supporting our electric infrastructure. And so like the wildfire expenses, there's a very good argument that that should be paid out of some other system than just ratepayer money. So whether that's coming from the tax base or cap and trade funding or something else, you can even make the same argument for some of the equity programs. We need low and middle income households to have subsidized electricity, and I think those programs should actually be expanded up the income ladder so that more people have access to that affordability support. But we can't do that by just raising everyone's rates, or you're just taking out of one pocket to put in the other. And so we need that money to be coming from a more progressive source of funding, like our state tax base, or from the cap and trade system. So we'll talk more about that more, but just some money from outside of the system. And then again, there are ways to change the utility model so that utilities can have like a lower rate of return. They don't necessarily need to be making 10% profits on every dollar that they invest. So, and that could be done just by the Public Utilities Commission just like saying, sorry, you only get 7% this year. Like, we could do that. We could also find other sources of financing so that they are not having to get their money on the sort of open commercial market, but maybe the state can be supporting them with financing options, and the state can leverage lower loan rates, and that can support the utility system so that we're all getting the benefit of that rather than the investors who own the utilities getting that benefit. So there's a whole bunch of different things in there, and each of them can chip away at the problem a little bit, but none of them are a silver bullet, for sure.
Okay, the audience is liking what they're hearing. Lee, do you want to answer that question too? Any other thoughts on that? How to bring down, how policymakers can bring down electric bills?
Yeah, I think those were a lot of the things that I probably would have said. I think that when we get to the cap and trade discussion, I think that some of the revenues that are that we earn as a state through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, there's a lot of people who want to use a lot of that money in different ways, but one of the things people have been talking about is potentially using some of those funds to help finance some of these, whether it's transmission lines or distribution infrastructure. So being able to tap into some of that funding at a lower interest rate than what you would have to get in the private sector, that could have very real positive implications for customers and rates. But yeah, I think in general, rate reform is something that I'm a big fan of. I think that gets at a lot of the things that we're concerned about with cost shifts through solar and cost shifts through these other programs. And then the last thing that he mentioned with not everything probably needs to be in rates that are currently in rates. There's some things that could probably be pushed to the state budget and would allow us to recover some of those costs, I think, a little bit more progressively. I think that's one of the big challenges that we see with rates right now is even if you are using some of the low-income programs that the Investor in Utilities and the PUC, or Public Utilities Commission, have been able to define. So there's the CARE program and the FARA program. Those are just pretty much binary programs. You're in it or you're not in it. You could be just above the income threshold, really hurting to pay your bills in the hottest part of the state, and like if you're above that income threshold, tough luck. Like you're going to be paying the same bill as someone who's making much more money than you living in a more temperate area. And so if we're able to shift some stuff to more of the progressive tax code or something like that, that could be a way to help recover things in a more meaningful way.
Lane, what are barriers to electrification in California?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big ones is electricity rates. When you do go to, when you're trying to compare the costs of like an EV versus a gas-powered car, even in a state that has gasoline prices as high as they are, like California, when you're comparing that up against the cost of electricity in the state, it doesn't necessarily always pencil out for you, or you're not seeing the cost savings that you might see in other states that might be encouraging you to do it. I think one of the big value propositions of an EV is the promise of lower operational costs. You might be paying a tad more upfront just because EVs aren't necessarily there from a cost parity perspective. And that becomes a little bit murkier also when we think about some of the federal tax credits. But really you want to make sure that those operational costs, so you're not having to pay as much when you have to go fill up, you want those to be a lot lower than they are for gasoline or for an internal combustion engine vehicle to really make EVs pencil out. And so that's kind of a tougher thing here. But also on the electrification side, if you're a renter or you live in an apartment building where you might not be able to control charging at home, that can be a huge burden. If you have charging at work or something, that's helpful. But if you're only purely relying on public infrastructure to be able to do this, that can get more expensive as well. And that can be a big inconvenience for customers. And so if that's something that you're actively weighing when you're deciding to buy an EV, or if you're trying to install a heat pump in your house, but you live in an apartment, you might not be able to do that.
Megan, what are some of the other barriers to electrification, particularly for housing?
Yeah, for housing, I think the installation process is incredibly, poses a lot of barriers, even in the best of circumstances. There is uncertainty around costs, as well as just the cost of the appliances and the work itself, but the permitting process, that poses huge barriers, as well as, and this is probably more specific to the Bay Area, so forgive me, but the age of housing. So the Bay Area has some of the oldest housing stock in the country, which is one of the reasons we love it, but San Francisco has the third oldest housing stock of any major city, of the major cities in the States, behind only Boston and Brooklyn. So
That's a fun trivia.
yeah, you're welcome. The median age of a house in San Francisco, for example, was like 1944, I think. In Berkeley, it's around the same, and like San Mateo is like 1961, right? So it's just, we have old houses. This is an incredible barrier just logistically for electrification and decarbonization. If you do not have a pre-existing air conditioning system, for example, which I think I mentioned this already, like 50% of homes do not. That's going to increase the labor costs, the amount of, you have to do ductwork, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know if you live in an old Victorian, I doubt you've ever even seen your ductwork. I doubt you, yeah. So things like that are actually incredible drivers of cost on the sort of beginning end of the process that a lot of folks, when they go into it, don't anticipate. And we've seen that play out in real time, where even a landlord is totally on board, wants to do it, but wants to electrify and do all of these things, but it's just at the beginning, the permitting, an older house, things like that really get in the way of kickstarting the process, and then you haven't even gotten to the rate situation. So things like that.
Yeah, there's an element where we have like 100 million homes in America, and every one of them is like an individual, unique snowflake of a problem we have to solve. And this is not, and we will get better at this as the contractors learn, as the products come to market, as homeowners learn more about this. It will get easier, and so installation costs will come down. but they are still a little bit high right now, so we need upfront incentives to help people through this transition. But it's really hard to sell the notion of like, oh, you should electrify your home, it's gonna be great. You're gonna pay more money at your utility bills. And people are like, what's the great part? It's like, well, it is more comfortable, it's healthier, it's better for the climate. Like, those are all important, but people do not want to pay more for their utility bills. So like, reducing there's all the friction in the process, but we also need the outcome to really just be a clear benefit for people. And that's where the rate design comes in, where we need to make, heat pump specific rates, so that if you're have a heat pump in your home, you're going to get a discount on your electricity rate because it's actually good for the grid for you to be using a heat pump. And virtual power plant systems where you can adjust the time of use of your power so that you are paying less because you're not using it at the peak times. And those kinds of methods, so that we can really make it so people will save money by electrifying. And then we also need to reduce all the friction to get there.
Have any of you seen innovative programs that could speed up the electrification process?
Yeah, there's systems. There's places where they're looking at like doing a whole neighborhood at once, and so that's going to be great for a contractor when you say like, great, line them up. I've got 10 houses in a row, and I'm going to come in each day and do each one of them, and so that's going to be more efficient. And you can get where there's a nonprofit entity that's going out and doing the recruitment of customers, because that's a lot of the cost for a contractor. You go out on and you put in bids on 10 different places and you only get one of the jobs. Like, that's a lot of money for you. But if someone else has already preconditioned all these people and made them ready for you to just, all you gotta do is show up and, install the system, like, that's a great thing. So there's like programs like that that can be innovative, that take some of the pain out of the process, both for the homeowner or landlord or whoever, and the contractor who's doing the work.
Yeah. We there's a block in Oakland that has tried this called EcoBlock, and I've reported on them a lot, and it's just a really interesting story about how that's all played out, and it's been very bumpy, but it's super interesting. You want to add something, and then we'll move to cap and trade?
Yeah. One other that I'd add is I think that some of the companies that are trying to make it easier to allow customers to install battery storage in their homes are really helpful. There is an interesting paper that just came out of Berkeley not too long ago showing that the changes in customer sentiment with some of the changes in reliability of the California grid have kind of changed people's opinions towards electrification. So people feeling like they're not sure what might happen if there's a public safety power shutoff, if all of their eggs are in the basket of everything's met by electricity. They're not sure if that's the best thing. Maybe they should have a foot in either camp, so to speak. And so having things like batteries that can help right through some of those events, I think can help people feel a little bit more comfortable. Having batteries that can help reduce your costs. So during peak times, maybe your battery is able to help you, use your heat pump or use, some of the different electricity loads during peak times, I think are helpful. And so there's a new company in Texas called Base Power Company that's looking at innovative ways of trying to get batteries in homes. I'm blinking on the company right now, but there was an interesting company profile today in Canary Media that seemed like they were kind of doing a similar thing here in California, trying to get more batteries in homes. And so I think batteries in many ways, I think, are trying to help and can help this process a lot more.
Just really quick, Emerald Cities has the program Tony's talking about. It's very new. San Francisco Healthy and Resilient Homes. We have 2 houses we're doing in the mission. We can come back to it.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Okay. Wait, what is Emerald City? Real quick, just tell us what you're talking about.
Yeah, so we have, we are trying to get off the ground a neighborhood decarbonization plan and pilot projects. We've started with 2 low-rise multifamily Victorians here in the mission, one deed restricted, one non-deed restricted, and it's a partnership with Poder, based in the neighborhood, part of the one, and we are doing a whole home electrification retrofit of each of the homes. They're a little bit different, so they're sort of a comparison. Some of the characteristics are different, but they're both tenant occupied, long-term tenant, and we've been doing that since October of last year.
Nice. Okay.
So we have lots of real-time how to use the incentive programs, what it is managing those projects, bringing in the contractors, getting the bids, which we did for both houses separately, as well as kind of how you leverage and layer all the different incentive programs that do make these projects work. So lots of learnings to share about each of them.
Yeah, that always seems so intensely hard to me. Okay, so I want to move on to cap and trade and hear your thoughts on that. It generates billions of dollars that fund climate programs across the state. It's our flagship climate program. But as reauthorization approaches, and we just heard it was last week that the governor and some other legislators announced that they want to try to reauthorize that program to be reauthorized in 2030. We need to ask how effective it is in its current form and how it can better serve Californians. So can we just get a quick, because cap and trade I feel like is one of those things that you hear a lot, but you're kind of like, if someone's like, how do you explain that? Like, so can one of you actually give us a quick explanation? Lane, can you do this? Just in layperson's terms so we all have a clear understanding of what we're talking about.
Yeah, so at a very high level, and with the cap and trade program, every year, every period, there are some number of allowances that are issued to. There's some issued to some of the larger emitters in the industry. So you see investor-owned utilities get some of them. You see that some of the like industry constrained groups that can't really do much about their emissions are issued some of them. And then there's a pool of these allowances in the state. And so for different, whether it's generators or customers who produce emissions, they have to go buy some of those allowances on a market so that they can run their natural gas generator or run their factory that produces emissions. And so quarterly, I believe, there's a market for these allowances. And so historically in California, these prices have been pretty low, and we haven't seen the cap and trade program produce huge cost shifts in the programs that you know. So it hasn't been a huge factor in raising your cost of electricity, natural gas, gasoline. Over time, though, the idea behind this program is that you reduce the number of allowances that folks can purchase. And with that, as that market begins to kind of squeeze, the prices for each allowance will increase. And so in the last couple of years, we've started to see the prices kind of increase above the price floor that's set in the program. But recently, because of some of the uncertainty about whether cap and trade will be reauthorized in 2030, you've seen those costs begin to decrease again. Because if it's not reauthorized, some of the people who already hold those allowances, they might have enough allowances, and so they don't need to go out and purchase more. So I think that's part of the reason we're seeing the push from the governor and some of the legislative leadership right now to try to reauthorize so that there can be longer term certainty in this program and try to get some of those market prices closer to where they are. But as you mentioned, this is one of the states' pushes for trying to provide some sort of carbon pricing. I will say that at least early iterations of cap and trade weren't really the main pushes of decarbonization in the state. That's where some of the states like clean energy standards, the renewable portfolio standard, those are kind of the things that were leading to larger decarbonization, electrification pushes in the state.
All right, so Tony, where is cap and trade revenue currently going? So part of it is that the part of it is that the money that you have to pay, like if you don't reduce your pollution, you pay a certain amount of money, and that goes to programs that are trying to prevent emissions, climate change, right? So what are those programs?
Right. So cap and trade makes polluters pay, and it goes into a fund called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and that's supposed to be used for projects that are going to also help lower greenhouse gas emissions in the state. And that's a variety of different things. There are, but one of the big dedicated sources or benefits of it is the high-speed rail program. Some people are big fans of high-speed rail. Some people think that hasn't yet shown being very effective. It's a lot of money going to a program that has not really been reducing emissions yet. There's other money that goes to housing programs, other decarbonization programs. The list is very long. It's a lot of different things. But and then there's a chunk of money that does come back to everyday people on their electric and gas bills as a climate incentive payment. And we actually all get this twice a year, and most people don't understand it, don't understand where it comes from, why it's there, but they're just like, okay, thanks for $100 on my utility bill in October.
Right, I mean, isn't it like, like $90 a
Yeah,
year?
it's not a ton of money, but it helps, and in some ways, like, it is a good thing, and like, this is something that, Citizens Climate Lobby has always pushed for, is this notion that we should be making polluters pay so that it becomes more and more expensive to pollute, and that will discourage people from polluting. But if you do that, it's gonna raise prices, so we have to make sure that people are supported in that process, and so we need to get the money back to everyday people, so that they can afford their utility bills, so that they can afford their, to power their vehicles or, whatever it might be. And so this is one piece of that, and I believe that more of our money should be going back to households to support people through this transition. That said, we also need to be taking some of the money from cap and trade and making sure that people can make the transition. And so that's whether that's decarbonizing their buildings, and so providing upfront incentives for people to install heat pumps, or providing incentives to buy electric vehicles, so that in the long term the price of gasoline might go up, but when you're not using gasoline, you don't really care. Like, I never look at the price of gasoline anymore because I ride a bike and an electric car, and so like, just don't even notice what the gas prices are. So we need to find that right balance between supporting people and supporting every single person in the state to afford, to make ends meet, while also providing specific incentives to make that transition. And in my opinion, I don't think that putting that money towards projects like high-speed rail is the right way to do that. I think money should be going to everyday people more directly. Not that I would love to be able to take the train faster to LA, but I think that in the short term, we really need to be focused on the affordability issue.
Megan, are you seeing some of those funds in your programs?
No, not yet. But the thing I will say about the cap and trade, especially the discussion that's going on imminently, is it does provide an opportunity for a new strategy around how California is going to meet these goals. I think historically, to meet the clean energy standards, there has been this, it's kind of something the state regulators, et cetera, fall back on, of just putting another surcharge direct to ratepayers, to households, et cetera. So the discussions going on right now around the cap and trade program are, number one, much better informed than I think they've been in the past. Much more people are at the table this time, and they provide an opportunity to correct this driver that we've relied on historically. It is, like Tony said, it's not the only thing that's going to fund these programs and et cetera, but it's absolutely a good starting point and I think the discussion now is about how we use the funds and where they go, and I think that we have some experience in it now as a state. And so the discussion around which incentive programs, how to design those programs, like the funding being used for those things, is critical. And I think it also boils down to, like Tony was saying, housing is the number one issue for everyone across the board. It might be our great unifier. And so the discussion now being about a cap and trade program that has historically had some naysayers and folks, et cetera, going towards housing and the cost of housing is huge. We've come a long way, but that's the discussion we're having now.
Okay.
And so it does provide a great opportunity now. What we do with it, we'll see. But I think that's, yeah.
And so if each of you had, your say and your magic wand, and you were going to reform cap and trade, what would you say you would prioritize in that change? Do you want to start, Lane?
Yeah, sure. I do agree that more needs to be returned to customers. I also think it's important to look at the great opportunity and the value in having something like the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and being able to use a pot of those funds to help drive down costs like we were talking about earlier. Maybe use some of those funds to help drive down the costs of expensive transmission and distribution, things that would be otherwise difficult to drive down some of those costs, where there can be benefits that may not be the immediate things that help make it easier to help pay a bill, but can have dividends in the long run. And I think something that we've been focusing a lot about is trying to find ways to have what is returned through the cap and trade program be a little bit more targeted to folks in the state who most need some of that support. So getting a little bit back to the electricity rate discussion we were having, so in PG&E service territory, which is a lot of Northern California and the Central Valley, everybody sees the same electricity price, but not everybody sees the same bills. People living in in like the Bay Area, much more temperate climate, your bills can be hundreds of dollars lower per month in the summer than folks who live in the Central Valley. And so being able to maybe use some of those funds to help folks who are in some of those warmer areas with even higher monthly bills can help not only reduce their costs, but reduce arrearages, reduce customer disconnections, and those also do have a benefit for the broader rate base too, because you don't have to then socialize costs that aren't being paid by others in their rates. So I think long-winded way of saying, I think we would love to see some of those funds be a little bit more targeted to better support customers who need it most.
Megan or Tony, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent use of that's. I completely agree with that. The only thing I would kind of yes and is a more regionalized approach, which is a little bit what you're saying. The Central Valley is the perfect example. They are often cut out of sort of the big discussions about needs, just population-wise. That ends up happening. But I think that using some of these funds to develop more regionally based incentive programs for whole home decarbonization would be my pick. Communities will come out and tell you what they need. You can characterize neighborhoods and develop plans on the neighborhood scale, things like that. The funds being used for programs that are kind of based in that would be a great way to also help preserve communities. So that would be my yes and to
What about you, Tony?
Yeah, lots of ideas. I mean, I work mostly in the building decarbonization sector, but I do want to say, it would also be good if we sent some money to decarbonize industry and reduce pollution from industrial systems and some of the other things, and money could go towards electrifying vehicles. But in terms of the housing and electric rates, there are states that have a percentage of income where maximum, so that no one has to pay more for their utilities than a certain percentage of their income. And I can imagine doing some system like that and using the cap and trade funds to help fund that, so that it wasn't just being paid by other ratepayers. Or even when you're saying we could take some of the cap and trade money and put it towards hardening the grid or wildfire mitigation issues, well, that is going to benefit all of us, because that's going to lower rates for all of us, as long as we do it in the right way, that money doesn't end up in PG&E's pockets instead, but it ends up in our pockets. So there's some balance here of lowering rates for everyone, so that everyone in the states sees electricity being cheaper, but then increasing the programs for low and middle income households, both making them better for the lowest income, but also raising the threshold so that even middle income people are seeing some of those benefits, and then using the cap and trade funds to support those so that it doesn't fall on the backs of the other ratepayers. And I think you can get some of those same issues of people who are paying a lot for air conditioning, they're never going to have to pay for more than a certain percentage of their income, regardless whether that's in the Bay Area, whether that's in the Central Valley, et cetera. So there are ways that states are exploring this, and I think that California just needs to figure out some system that's going to make the right balance between those different systems.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's talk about finally designing strong and lasting climate programs. Successful climate policy needs to effectively lower emissions, but it also needs public buy-in. So how do we build programs that are resilient and equitable and beneficial to all Californians? From your perspective, Lane, it seems like you study this quite a bit, so I'm going to ask you, what makes a climate policy durable in the long run?
I think one of the main things that we see is having, consumer buy-in to a lot of stuff. I think that that's one of the things that is starting to come up with cap and trade reauthorization right now. I think you saw there be issues with that with Canada's carbon pricing system, which with the new change in Prime Minister there, they ended up moving away from some of their climate rebate program that, even though is much more progressive up there than it is here, was still largely unpopular. And so I think that here you're seeing, especially from the governor's team and some of legislative leadership, a lot more of a focus on, we can use this to address affordability challenges. I think how they're intending to do that is still a little bit murky. So I think we're going to kind of wait on the follow-up to the announcement they just did. But you are starting to see them trumpet that a little bit more. And so I think they're trying to tap into, hey, there might be certain things where prices increase, but this program still does help you. And so I think that's something that we notice a lot. You want to make sure that this is, meeting communities where they are, helping them out. And then like in our work, we try to make sure that, policies that we're proposing or things that we're looking into, adjustments to certain policy programs, that it has the buy-in of different like environmental justice groups, that it has buy-in of different consumer-facing groups. We try to interact with the utilities too to try to understand the, how feasible it would be to implement something like that, where the, friction points would be. So I think you need to make sure that your stakeholders are on the same page and that at the end of the day, customers are on board.
Megan, what are your thoughts on that? How to make sure that these programs have public support?
Yeah, I think from where I sit in the space that I work in, the number one thing that actually encourages support is planning for implementation. Designing a policy is not separate, but for the public, for the consumer, it's not where they live. It just isn't. And so if you are a decision maker, regulator, et cetera, policy maker, if you cannot speak to implementation in whatever the policy is you are designing, you don't have one. You just have an idea. So I think in the climate space, if you can build in planning for implementation, and that's programs that do job training or consider utility impacts or incentive programs, et cetera, we could go down the list. But I think the way to build a sustainable climate policy in terms of buy-in is to build implementation into the policy you are proposing. So that's my.
Okay, thank you. All right, and Tony, last question from me. How do we offer more certainty and stability to businesses trying to plan for the energy transition?
Change our federal government right now.
We haven't talked at all about all of that stuff.
Yeah, that is really critical because for businesses, especially, and for all of us to plan, you need to know what's the environment, what's the policy going to be in 5 years and 10 years, and so it's very important for us to reauthorize cap and trade because 2030 is only 5 years away, and people are making investment decisions for equipment that they want to know. What environment am I going to be working on? What's the landscape going to be? Because these are decisions that we're making for the next 15 years. When you buy a car, you want to know, what are things going to be like in 15 years? Where am I going to live? How am I going to pay for those costs? So anything that gives people stability, predictability, et cetera, is going to help. That said, I do think that there's what you're talking about, like the user experience of climate policy, of the process of this transition is important, and that's both at the household level, but it's also important at the business level. They need to know what is the process going to be for making this transition. If we can make that smoother and easier for them and clear, even if it's sometimes it's this is going to be painful, but we've made it very clear what the process is for you to make the change, then I think that's going to be part of the key to that. So it's both that certainty is part of that being clear and making it easy for them is to just have a simple system that they know that they can predict and they know how it's going to work.
Okay. I would love to invite you all up to come line up here, and if you have questions, you can speak them into the shiny red microphone. Little added bonus. So while you're coming and lining up, let's give these folks a round of applause for just. All right, you have a question.
Yeah, so please introduce yourself, and if you would, say something about why you're here.
Hi everyone, my name is Kelly Aves. Right now I work in local solar policy, but I used to work at the Illinois PUC. So I'm really interested in your conversation about rate reform, both at the PUC, maybe lowering the rate of return and shifting some of these costs away from rates into just the general tax base. And so being less familiar with the California, how things are done in the state, wanting to know how receptive the PUC and the legislature is to those types of reforms.
It seems like, Tony, you've worked with the PUC,
Yeah.
right?
I'll say that a lot of it, it requires pressure from the governor. I think when the governor is on board with something, it makes a big difference in how the PUC handles things. They are appointed regulators, and they are going to respond a lot to who's in charge, who appoints them, and they get pressure from the governor. They do things, and so I think so there's a lot of politics involved in here. That said, I do think that the PUC is getting the message that something has to be done, and they haven't figured out exactly what that is, and they're sort of bureaucrats and things move slowly, but they are getting the message that something has to be done, and they are trying hard to do something about it. But I think a lot of our pressure, as an advocate, you're going to want to put some pressure on both through the legislators and through the governor, because I think they have the ability to tell the PUC what to do, and that's really where you get some of the fastest change is actually through our elected officials rather than through our appointed bureaucrats.
And I think one other thing I would add is that if I remember correctly, a couple of years ago when there was the bill that was passed to do the new income graduated fixed charge implementation, there was also a bill on the table that was seeking to shift some of the costs from rates to the state budget, and that bill wasn't successful. That bill died. I think last year I was hearing that it might be resurrected or something like that, but as far as I've been able to see, it hasn't been. So yeah, I think that it's something where the regulators like to take their cue from the legislators, and I think that that's something that is maybe something they were considering at one time, but haven't been, or there hasn't been something formal that I've seen recently.
Yeah, that did die, and it was, it didn't go great. So it is unfortunate, to answer your question, it's a very political process, and like Tony was saying, pressuring the governor is right now the best. I think that's the best lever available. But I will also say that the Public Utilities Commission got its fair share of bad press after the last round, and they thought, I think, as did many utilities, that the safety argument was going to really sway everybody. And I can tell you it didn't, because nobody felt. The truth is, nobody felt that. I didn't make it unsafe, so I'm now paying for something that I did not make unsafe. Right. So that's been kind of the public discussion of these very heated discussions with the CPUC. But pressuring the governor is the number one way.
There also seem to be a lot of bills that have been introduced this year in the name of bringing down electricity bills. Is that an increase in that? Are you noticing that as well?
Yeah, they're freaking out.
Yeah.
People are pissed. Everyone is noticing that their costs are going up and they can't afford it. They're having to make tough choices. Deciding between heating and eating, and that is not an acceptable thing. And legislators are hearing that, and they want to do something, but they do not know what to do yet. And then they are simultaneously getting pressure from, PG&E is a powerful entity. They have lobbyists. They go in there and they try and stop the legislatures from doing things that need to get done. And so there is also an element here of we need to fight back against what the investor-owned utilities are doing. And one thing there is preventing them from using our ratepayer money to lobby our elected officials. And so if they want to use their investor money to lobby elected officials, we can't stop them, that's fine. But they shouldn't be using my money to lobby against my interests. That's just
public power.
Exactly. Or we should get rid of IOUs completely.
Okay, we have one more person, and if anybody else is interested, please line up here at the pillar. And I just want to throw one specific number in. I looked a month or so ago at my PG&E bill, and my electricity rate per unit power was 4 times my gas rate. And I'm in a climate where mostly we need to heat. We don't even have air conditioning. It's personally not a huge burden, but it's hard to find a heat pump that's 4 times more efficient than a gas furnace, okay? So I think I'd love you guys to be specific about some of these quantitative barriers to the extent you can be. And with that, tell us a little bit who you are and what that does.
My name is Emma Conroy, and I do energy efficiency research to inform California's energy code, building codes. And my question is, you referenced a lot of different organizations that are working to help support electrification and decarbonization, and some of those are private companies, and some of those are nonprofits, and some of those are run by the state, and some are not. And there's a lot of them that are all trying to do really good work. And my question is, how do you think they can work together to kind of share best practices and learnings and make their work more effective by working together with other organizations and collaboratives that have similar goals?
Who wants to start? Tony?
I'll just say that like we are in a stage right now where data and shared knowledge and experience is really valuable. I mean, you're working on these 2 projects and you're learning a lot in that process, and that's going to be shared with other people doing this work. And like some of the community choice aggregators, like your alternative to PG&E on your utility bill, like they're collecting data on like what does it actually cost to upgrade people, and then what are their utility costs after they've upgraded to a heat pump. And having that data allows us to both convince regulators like, hey, you can do this and it is affordable, or here's what you need to change to make it affordable. And then like there's a California state program that's also collecting, they're doing direct installs to low-income households, and in that process they can say, so this is what it actually costs to install a heat pump, and this is what it should cost, and if you're paying more than that, you probably shouldn't pay that much. And so like that kind of data is very beneficial, and it's just starting to be collected and disseminated and like analyzed. And so I think there is really a need, as you're identifying, for all these organizations to start collaborating together. And there are groups doing that. I mean, the Building Decarbonization Coalition in California is a great organization that's bringing together both the manufacturers and the advocates and working for the state and creating a one-stop shop for people who are trying to decarbonize their homes. So there is, some of it is happening, it's getting better, but there's still a long way to go to make sure that we're all rowing in the same direction and supporting each other in that work.
Yeah, I think I don't know if it's advice exactly, but I would start hyper-locally, collaborating hyper-locally and build up. I think that sometimes in this work what happens is the call to action that you just put out, for example, I don't know where you went. Sorry, there you go. You're right, the big state agencies should all be talking to each other. I can tell you that it doesn't happen in the way you think it's going to, even if they're on the same phone call. So my advice, and the most effective kind of collaboration I've witnessed, is coalitions that form more hyper-locally and build out or up, depending on their need. So I don't know what municipality you work with, for example, but I would start in the city, see if you can get everybody at the same table, go from there. That kind of thing seems to be much more effective in this space than trying to get all the big kids at one table at one time. And they eventually talk to each other if you're annoying enough.
Should we do one more question, or we have 2?
I think
We have 2 more questions, all right. And then
So your name and a little bit about your
My name is Brooke, and I'm a master's student at UC Berkeley studying utility regulation and electric grid decarbonization. I know this is a little bit of a contentious topic, but I'm surprised to not have heard a little bit more about solar cost shifting. From what I can see, a lot of estimates put about 20% of most people's bills as due to this solar cost shifting issue. If any of you disagree with that number, I would love to hear some more specifics of why. Alternatively, I'd love to just hear how each of you is thinking about this issue, potential solutions, things like that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that's something that I agree, it's a big challenge right now. I think that I've seen a couple solutions proposed. One is a bill right now. I forget the bill number, but they're trying to basically, I think it'd be in 2026 if you've had a solar system and been on a legacy net metering program for over 10 years, that you'd be kicked off that program and be forced to shift to net metering 3.0. am not a lawyer, but I have to imagine that there would be a lot of legal challenges with that, just with basically the contract that you're basically signing with your utility when you take service under net metering 1.0 or 2.0. I've seen the Public Advocate's Office suggest maybe you cap the export credits that you get at various times. So if you signed up for it in 2019, maybe your export amount is what your rate was when you were a customer in 2019, rather than what you see it is right now, because of the positive feedback effect of net metering. I think that we're a little less, so in my group, we're a little less bullish on the idea of being able to change the structure of these contracts. I don't necessarily disagree with the rationale behind the push for them. We're just not sure how that will hold up legally. I think some of the things that we're interested in is trying to find other ways to incentivize folks to get off legacy net metering programs. Like one of the ways that we've been interested in is if you can find ways to either provide or help subsidize folks to get batteries, let's say. It's much more lucrative to be on the new net billing tariff or net metering 3.0 if you have solar and storage than it is to be on the other legacy net metering programs. So if you can find a way to say, hey, we might subsidize you to get this storage, maybe you're having to be enrolled into a virtual power plant program or something like that, and there's other benefits that you can get, but we're helping subsidize this for you, that there can be an incentive to get off of the legacy net metering programs and onto the net billing tariff, which also has some of its own challenges and things that you would probably want to change in an ideal world. But I think something like that could be a little bit less contentious than some of the other solutions that have been put out there.
Tony, you said you're a believer in the cost shift. Anything else you want to add to that?
I also note that it is a issue that divides the climate movement, and that is not good for our movement. And so the fact, because we do need to install more solar, and there are benefits to rooftop solar from a whole bunch of different reasons, and so I think it is good at some level that we are incentivizing solar and rooftop solar, but there are also costs to it. So it's a nuanced thing, and it became a huge battle, and I think it was destructive for our advocacy movement. And I'm actually more worried about that than some of the other issues of we do need to figure out just how to lower people's bills altogether, and I'm not sure that focusing our ire on rooftop solar is the best path for us to get there. Doesn't mean I dispute any of the numbers. I think they're real. I think if the cost shift is real, I think we do need to do something about it, but it has to be one among many solutions here. And I think there's a lot of solutions that we can all agree on, and we should be focusing on those as well.
Yeah. Do you want to add anything, Megan?
Yeah, actually the same thing. I don't dispute the numbers necessarily, but the end result of the fight was that solar came off the table in most incentive programs for decarbonization, and that has been extremely detrimental. So we did not end up where we wanted. So I agree.
and there's an issue where you can have something that's true, and then also the investor-owned utilities are using that to divide us and using that to blame solar for something. And it's and the hard part is that there's a grain of truth in it, but it's also being weaponized against us. And so
there's fact, and then there's the truth of the matter, and those two things. IOUs are not who I trust to put that forward. So that's what I agree, Tony.
What's your question?
Hi, folks. Yeah, Jameson, and I do account management and follow policy for an electrical wholesaler distributor that primarily sells to contractors installing residential solar. So my question is sort of a follow-up to yours. Is there anything legislation-wise or just regulatory policy, anything that would be relevant to putting solar back on the table in terms of incentives? And for Tony, you made a point earlier about preventing investor-owned utilities from using ratepayer money in lobbying efforts. Is there anything on the books to make that happen, or more broadly for each of you, what legislation are you most excited about in the current climate?
I think that's a great last question.
Yeah, so good. Forward looking. Tony, do you want to start?
I mean, I think there is a bill to prevent the lobbying, but I don't know the number. Does anybody know?
I was just gonna say, I can't remember the number either. Carly, do you know that?
I think I read that as well.
But I think it's out there. So like we can, we should get that information. We should, make it so that people are writing their legislators and saying like, hey, stop spending my money to lobby against my interests. That's just basic. So like, yes, 100% on that. I don't know.
What other legislation are you looking into or excited about?
Yeah, you had another half of your question, like specifically for contractors. Is there anything?
Yeah, I mean, with tariffs and, F3 and T, like,
Yeah.
there's a lot of uncertainty and anxiety in the space right now. We've seen battery costs shoot up, for example, so.
So the short answer is there's nothing that would no piece of legislation that's going to specifically benefit contractors. I think in the way that you're asking, there are some interesting pieces of legislation that go to jobs, and I'm going to get the number wrong, but I want to say 352, which has to do with importing electricity from other Western states. Yeah, supporting a connection. Is it 352?
Yeah,
325?
the pathways initiative.
Yes, thank you. But it recently, IBEW came out in support and has been working on that piece of legislation. And previously, they were they were opposed. But now they have found a way to protect existing jobs under that piece of legislation and maybe create some new ones in the pathways proposal. So that's one. That's not exactly what you asked, I know, sorry. But in terms of potential for contractors in the solar installation space, there's no piece of legislation, but I really encourage everyone in your line of work to get behind the California Energy Commission's Equitable Building Decarb program, incentive program, which is a whole home retrofit incentive program for low income households in California. And we are working to include solar in that and trying to get that in the next phase. And that's an uphill battle for sure. So I would say, I don't have any piece of legislation for you right off the top of my head, but incentive programs, there's advocacy to be done around them and their design and to bring solar back into them. And that would be hugely beneficial for contractors.
I think for me, so I think one of your questions was, things that you're excited about or thinking about that can help keep solar on the table.
Or energy storage batteries as well.
Okay, yeah. Well, I feel like on the storage front, we have seen, I think, like some of the policies, like the net billing tariff has been successful in driving more storage installs than what we've seen before. I think we're seeing some of the solar installs rebound a little bit from what they were a couple years ago. With that there was that dip right after the shift from NEM 2 to net billing tariff. I think the small silver lining to how terribly high electricity rates are is that it's a really strong incentive to be able to install those things, even without something like net metering 2. So if you're a contractor trying to get those things on people's roofs and batteries in people's garages, I think I saw that the incentive now, or at least like I think late last year, is similar to what it was in 2019 under net metering 2.0. And that's kind of like the golden years of net metering 2.0. So I think that there's still like incentives there for folks to install solar and storage. I think that there's concerns with how that stuff might clash with just broader affordability issues right now, just what we're seeing in the current broader climate with everything, that maybe that's not the thing people feel like they want to throw money at right now when you're watching like stock portfolios drop and all the other things in your life become more expensive. I think so. I don't know. I guess good news, bad news on that front. But I think that there's things that are exciting there. VPPs I think are exciting if we can find more ways to tap into them. I think like especially in Texas, there's a lot of really cool program designs going on that would be great if we could find a way to tap into them. Here in California, it's a different deregulated market in Texas, but I think trying to look to some of the interesting like business plans, business strategies there, I'm always fascinated trying to think about ways to tie lessons learned from what we're seeing with like the retail side there to like what we could do with like VPPs here potentially. And then legislation wise, yeah, I think I should have come prepared with some of like bill numbers and stuff like that. But some of the stuff behind just the broader affordability pushes, I've been excited to see more folks thinking about that because I felt like that was something that everyone just kind of kicked down the road for a long time. Is like, yeah, affordability is a challenge, but like, what can you do? And so like now it seems like people are at least trying to do stuff on that. And then I haven't checked in on the status of it recently, but there were a few things in there on data centers, which I think are interesting because in the power system space, data centers are a big talk right now. I think probably pretty much everywhere in energy. Just at the like what that means for potential cost increases. You'll hear the utilities talk about that as a way to potentially reduce costs if you're able to shift demand around effectively. I'm a little bit skeptical on that because I don't think we have the programs to necessarily do that. But I am excited to see that we're trying to get out ahead of data centers a little bit, whereas in the past I feel like that was something they would just like hit us and we would have been trying to deal with that a couple years after they hit us. So I think there's two bills. One was trying to find ways to deal with how they're interconnected to the grid. So trying to like deal with the permitting side of things. And then the second one was, I think, trying to come up with rate structures that make it so that costs aren't shifted as much onto other customers. So like certain large data centers have to kind of bear some of their own costs. But I think, yeah, those are some of the things I think are interesting.
There's also some bills on virtual power plants. There's 3 that I know of. One's in the Senate, 2 in the Assembly to try to promote them with CCAs and also the investor-owned utilities. Okay, thank you all so much. Those were awesome questions. Such knowledge in this room, and then also, of course, with the 3 of you. So thank you so much, and thank you to Citizens Climate Lobby for putting this together and for all the work that you're tirelessly doing. Lindsay and Joni, thank you for putting this event together. So let's just give them all a round of applause and Great, and I think you all will be here for like 15 minutes or so, right? So if folks want to come up and ask you some questions, feel free. Okay, thanks everyone for being here.
For those who need to leave, please use this door. There's another